Captured NVA and Viet Cong fighters were often processed at U.S.-run prisoners of war and detention sites in South Vietnam. Many of those fighters expected harsh treatment. They had spent weeks or months in jungle conditions, wet uniforms, little fresh water, and long patrols with no chance to wash. Hygiene was a low priority in the field. When a man was taken, the usual assumption was the same as in any war. Captivity meant danger, rough handling, and a loss of dignity. Propaganda and rumor made the fear worse. Prisoners had heard stories about beatings, abuse, and camps far from home. That expectation shaped how they looked at every soldier in a different uniform. In many U.S.-run sites, processing followed a set routine. Prisoners were counted, searched for weapons, and given basic medical checks. At some larger facilities, the next step included showers. That detail surprised more than a few captives. Soap, warm water, and a chance to clean themselves were things many had not seen for weeks. The showers were functional, not luxurious. Pipes and simple washrooms, a stack of bars of soap, and lines of men taking turns. The soap was standard-issue bar soap. The water was often heated or at least warmed by the system on site. After washing, prisoners were issued clean clothing or uniforms to wear while in custody. This was not universal across every detention site. Conditions varied with location and command. But at a number of U.S.-run camps, the practice of delousing, showering, and issuing clean clothes was routine. Red Cross access, medical inspections, and documentation guided many of these procedures. Where the Red Cross or military inspectors visited, records show processing steps meant to prevent disease and to document prisoner treatment. For fighters used to jungle grime and frequent shortages, the simple act of being handed a bar of soap and shown how to wash felt unexpected. It changed immediate perceptions. Hygiene was a practical need, but it also carried symbolism. It signaled the captor's approach to handling prisoners, orderly, regulated, and under a set of policies rather than ad hoc roughness. Beyond the immediate surprise, there were practical effects. Clean clothes reduced disease spread. Medical checks picked up wounds or infections that needed treatment. Basic hygiene cut the risk of lice and skin disease. For camp commanders, these were public health measures. For the prisoners, they were reminders they were now under the control of an organized system, not simply abandoned or punished without rules. This moment, the shower, the soap, the clean clothing appears repeatedly in contemporary accounts and inspection notes from detention sites. It became one of the small but memorable contrasts between frontline conditions and life behind wire. For many captives, that contrast was the first time they experienced a different side of captivity than what they had expected. After processing, life inside the camps followed a fixed routine. Each day started early, with roll call and inspection. Guards checked uniforms, bunks, and living areas. It wasn't luxury, but it was organized. For most captured soldiers, that level of order was unfamiliar. The jungle had no routine, only survival. Inside the wire, everything happened at set times. Showers were scheduled several times a week. They were quick and supervised, but consistent. Buckets of disinfectant powder were used on clothes and bedding. Soap was provided again and again, something rare even for soldiers outside captivity. U.S. personnel treated hygiene as part of camp management, not as kindness. To them, clean prisoners meant fewer diseases and less trouble. But to the captives, it felt almost civilized, even strange. American field manuals from that time showed clear instructions. Prisoners had to be kept clean, fed, and treated under the Geneva Conventions. Inspectors and Red Cross teams later confirmed these steps. In larger bases like Long Binh or Bien Hoa, where thousands of prisoners were processed, the same systems repeated: showers, delousing, medical checks, and clean clothing. Some reports even noted the use of soap brands shipped directly from U.S. stock, white bars with strong scent, unlike the simple lye soap many Vietnamese knew. The difference was obvious. Many captives remembered the smell of soap more than the food. For men who had lived months in mud and rain, the first wash felt unreal. It wasn't comfort, just cleanliness, but that alone carried weight. To them, it showed something they hadn't expected. The Americans followed rules. After cleaning, prisoners were assigned to work details: cooking, laundry, maintenance, or camp repairs. Water tanks and wash areas stayed active all day.
American medics often supervised sanitation to prevent infection. If someone got sick, they were sent to a small medical hut for treatment. Records show antibiotics and antiseptics being used, things few prisoners had seen before. Many camps had strict inspections from American command. Disease outbreaks were serious risks in tropical weather, so the daily showers, soap distribution, and laundry rotations were part of military discipline, not luxury. But for the captured men, it was still shocking to see an army so focused on hygiene, even for its enemies. Letters and interviews years later often mentioned that same surprise. "They gave us soap," one former prisoner said, "even for us." That detail stayed in memory more than anything else. Not the fences, not the guards, but the smell of soap, the clean water, and the strange calm inside a camp run by the enemy. The idea of captivity looked different here. The showers and sanitation didn't erase the fact of being prisoners, but they did change how many viewed their captors. For men who expected punishment, the experience of being treated under medical and hygiene rules was something entirely new. Cleanliness inside the camps became more than just a routine. It was part of how the Americans ran everything. Each task was timed and recorded. Buckets were lined up, soap bars counted, and towels distributed in rows. The guards were trained to keep order without unnecessary violence. It wasn't mercy, it was method. Every system, from washing to eating, had a schedule. For the prisoners, that order felt strange at first. They had lived by instinct, hiding from helicopters, digging into wet ground, eating rice cold from their hands. In the jungle, no one cared about smell or dirt. Sweat, mud, and insects were part of life. But in the camps, those habits didn't fit. Dirty uniforms were replaced, bedding was changed, even nails and hair were checked for lice. The men learned to expect a whistle or shouted command for the next step. Shower, eat, line up, rest. American officers wrote reports describing these measures as sanitation and morale control. They believed that keeping prisoners clean reduced tension and kept the camps manageable. In tropical climates like South Vietnam, diseases could spread fast. Skin infections, malaria, fungus, lice. So hygiene was both discipline and self-preservation. When prisoners stayed healthy, guards had fewer problems. But from the other side of the wire, the effect was deeper. To the Vietnamese fighters, the soap and order weren't just physical, they carried meaning. Every rinse of warm water, every clean shirt, every small medical check was proof that the Americans didn't treat them like animals. It challenged what they'd been told before capture, that the enemy would humiliate or kill them. Still, not every camp was the same. Some smaller or temporary holding sites had rougher conditions. Water shortages, overcrowding, or field circumstances sometimes limited hygiene.
But at the larger, more permanent camps, Long Binh, Pleiku, Da Nang, showers and delousing were consistent parts of the process. U.S. military records and Red Cross inspections confirmed that soap, medical care, and regulated food distribution were part of the official standards. Over time, prisoners adjusted to it. They began to look forward to the shower days. It was one of the few times they felt something close to relief. The strong smell of American soap, sometimes a citrus scent, sometimes plain, became familiar. It stayed on their skin, on the clothes they wore afterward, and even in their memory years later. For the Americans, these routines were simple logistics. For the captives, they became one of the strangest parts of war, realizing that the same army that had bombed their villages and fought them in the jungle could still hand them a bar of soap and tell them to clean themselves. That contradiction stayed with many of them long after release. Some later described it in interviews. It made no sense. They fought us, but then they cleaned us. Others said the first shower after capture was the first time they felt safe again, if only for a few minutes. Even though the camps were surrounded by fences and guards, the feeling of being treated under rules, not rage, left an impression. The soap and showers, small as they seemed, became a symbol of how differently both sides understood war. For the prisoners, it was about the dignity they didn't expect to keep. For the Americans running the POW camps, discipline wasn't just about control, it was part of the job. Most of the guards were regular soldiers, not specialists. Some had rotated from combat units. They knew what it meant to fight in the jungle, to go weeks without clean water or rest. So when they were assigned to guard duty, the rules and standards they followed came straight from the same system that kept their own men alive. Clean gear, clean hands, clean barracks. To an outsider, the routine looked strict, but it came from something deeper in American military culture: order, efficiency, and doing things by the book. The U.S. Army had long believed that how it treated prisoners said something about who Americans were as a people. That belief showed up even in the smallest things: a warm shower, a clean uniform, a medical check, a meal served at the same time each day. It wasn't about comfort, it was about setting an example. Reports from inspectors and officers noted that camps with regular hygiene schedules had fewer problems, less sickness, fewer escapes, fewer fights. Guards respected the routine because it worked, and prisoners, whether they realized it or not, responded to it. The shock of capture faded into something closer to acceptance. Most followed the rules because they saw those rules enforced fairly. When Red Cross representatives visited the larger camps, they often found them in order: men accounted for, facilities maintained, water tanks full, soap stocked. The visits weren't performances, they were part of regular transparency. For American officers, showing that their camps followed regulations was a point of pride. They documented supplies, kept rosters, and wrote detailed reports. Many of those records still exist today. Letters from former U.S. personnel described the same atmosphere. "We did our best to run it clean and decent," one guard later said. "Didn't mean we liked them, but we weren't going to treat anyone the way we didn't want our own boys treated." That mindset defined much of how American-run POW sites operated. The men in charge had seen what happened in other wars: mistreatment, chaos, disease, and they didn't want that on their record. The Geneva Conventions weren't just rules, they were a reflection of American self-image. In the middle of a brutal and unpopular war, many soldiers still believed that how they handled prisoners said something about the difference between them and their enemy. For the NVA and Viet Cong prisoners, that difference showed up most clearly in the small, ordinary routines: the soap, the water, the daily inspection. These weren't luxuries they expected from their captors. To many, it was their first encounter with American order up close: the way every process had a checklist, every detail had a reason. Over time, those habits shaped how some prisoners saw the Americans themselves. Later interviews from released POWs and post-war researchers describe mixed emotions: confusion, respect, even quiet admiration for how clean and disciplined the camps were. The showers especially came up often. It wasn't the soap alone that surprised them, but what it represented: that even in war, the Americans kept a sense of structure and humanity. In the middle of a conflict defined by chaos, where jungles burned, villages were evacuated, and the line between friend and enemy was blurred, these camps stood out as controlled spaces. Inside the wire, everything was counted, cleaned, and managed. To the Americans, it was a duty. To the prisoners, it was proof that their enemy lived by a different code. And for history, that small act, handing a man a bar of soap and telling him to clean up, became one of the quiet reminders that even in the hardest wars, discipline and decency could still exist side by side. Inside the camps, life revolved around repetition: the same whistle at dawn, the same line for food, the same short inspections before rest. For the Americans, that structure wasn't meant to break men, it was meant to keep them in motion. A still camp, one without activity or purpose, was the kind that bred tension. Soldiers who had seen what boredom did in the field knew that idle men could turn desperate fast. So the officers created a rhythm. The mornings began with counts and cleaning. Afternoons were quieter, scheduled times for maintenance, laundry, or medical checks. Some camps introduced simple labor tasks: repairing fences, carrying supplies, or helping with kitchen work. The tasks were controlled, supervised, and limited by strict rules from the command.
Nothing that could give a prisoner leverage or weapons, but the routine itself gave structure to men who had lost everything familiar. In letters home, American guards often described their duties as quiet but tense. They knew they were part of a system designed to hold the enemy humanely, but they also knew that the enemy didn't always see it that way. Some prisoners looked them in the eye with anger that didn't fade for months. Others avoided contact altogether. For many guards, it was strange duty. They'd fought against these same men. Now they were feeding them, checking their temperatures, handing out rations one tray at a time. That kind of duty tested patience. Training had prepared them to follow orders, not emotions. Professional distance, one officer called it. He wrote that the goal was not to befriend or punish, only to maintain order. Every interaction was supposed to follow procedure: communication through interpreters, hand signals when needed, and firm, simple language. The Army's own manuals warned guards against improvisation. Predictability, one regulation stated, is control. At the larger camps, such as Long Binh and Da Nang, military police units took over most of the operation. These were men trained specifically in security and regulation, not combat patrols. Their facilities had administrative buildings, infirmaries, food storage, and sanitation centers, all designed with checklists and inspection points. Every week, reports traveled up the chain: prisoner counts, medical updates, incidents, supply inventories. Commanders compared data between camps, making sure standards matched across regions. It was a level of organization that reflected American military habits, the belief that even war could be managed like logistics. And, in many ways, it worked. Disease rates stayed lower than expected for a tropical environment. Food supplies were consistent despite transport challenges. Medical teams, sometimes including captured Vietnamese doctors, were used to treat wounds and tropical illnesses. The medical records, declassified decades later, show a surprising amount of detail. Temperature readings, blood pressure, infection logs, everything written in neat English script. It wasn't for sentiment, it was documentation, evidence of compliance, and part of a broader effort to show that the U.S. military maintained order according to international standards. From the American perspective, that attention to detail was about integrity. They knew the war was being watched by the press, by allies, by critics back home. Running clean, documented camps wasn't just the right thing to do, it was proof of discipline. The American public, still reeling from images of chaos in the jungles, expected their soldiers to represent something better, a sense of control in a war that often seemed uncontrollable. That expectation carried weight. Many guards felt it personally. Some came from small towns in the Midwest or the South, sons of veterans from Korea or World War II, and they carried an inherited sense of duty. Their fathers had told them that how a man treats his enemy says more than how he fights him. In the camps, that old belief resurfaced. It didn't mean sympathy, but it meant restraint. When fights broke out among prisoners, which they sometimes did between different factions or regional groups, guards moved fast. They separated the men, recorded the incident, and treated injuries without delay. Reports noted that American personnel often intervened to stop violence between prisoners themselves. That kind of management didn't make headlines, but it reflected something important: a consistent effort to keep the camps under control, not through fear, but through predictability and fairness. For the prisoners, those qualities didn't erase resentment, but they left an impression. Interviews decades later reveal that some remembered their captors as firm but not cruel. A few recalled American medics treating infected wounds carefully or distributing mosquito nets when malaria spread. One described a moment during a rainstorm when guards helped cover the prisoners' barracks with tarps to prevent flooding. A small gesture, but one that stayed in his mind long after. There were, of course, moments of tension. War doesn't stop at the fence line. News of attacks outside, ambushes, lost patrols, casualties could ripple through the camp. Guards who'd lost friends sometimes had to face the men responsible. Commanders rotated shifts to prevent emotional burnouts, knowing that too much familiarity or too much anger could both lead to problems. The military police training emphasized neutrality. Control the situation, not the feeling. By 1971, the camps had evolved into fully functioning systems. American logistics ensured steady food supplies: rice, vegetables, canned goods, occasionally meat. The prisoners learned the schedules by heart. Even the distribution of cigarettes became part of the rhythm. Each batch was counted, signed off, and passed through interpreters. To the Americans, those small exchanges were transactions of order. To the prisoners, they became part of the strange new world where their enemies treated them under regulations instead of revenge. Many historians later noted that this contrast, the professionalism of the camps against the chaos of the jungle war, told a larger story. The Americans, for all the criticism that surrounded the Vietnam conflict, never lost sight of procedure. The system they built reflected not only power but principle. The belief that war could still have boundaries, even when fought in mud and monsoon. And in those quiet corners of a divided country, far from television cameras and headlines, that principle played out in daily routines: soap, water, food, medical checks, and paperwork. Small things that spoke to something bigger. A sense that even when the mission blurred, the discipline remained.
As the war dragged into its final years, the camps themselves began to change. The United States was shifting from offense to withdrawal. Troop numbers were shrinking, and the focus turned to turning responsibilities over to South Vietnamese forces. That transition didn't just happen on the battlefield, it reached the POW compounds too. By 1972, many American-run camps were partly managed by South Vietnamese personnel under U.S. supervision. The same systems the Americans had built, the sanitation schedules, food distribution, and medical records, were handed over piece by piece. The U.S. advisors trained local officers on inspection routines, supply accountability, and the Geneva procedures that had defined the camp's structure. There were handbooks written specifically for this purpose, simple translated manuals on camp discipline and health management. They included diagrams for water storage, latrine spacing, and even instructions on how to distribute soap efficiently to avoid shortages. That attention to procedure reflected the mindset the Americans had established. Even in withdrawal, order came first. While some camps began to scale down, others consolidated, gathering remaining prisoners from smaller regional sites into larger centralized compounds. Long Binh facility became one of the main hubs, not just for holding prisoners, but for processing releases and transfers as the war moved toward peace talks. For the guards who remained, the work grew heavier in a different way. There were fewer hands, fewer resources, and a sense that the mission they had maintained for years was nearing its end. But even in that atmosphere of uncertainty, the routines continued: inspections, showers, medical checks. The sound of running water from the camp wash stations was still part of the daily rhythm. Former American personnel later recalled that those final months were some of the most disciplined of all. "We were short-staffed," one military policeman said, "but nobody wanted to let it fall apart. We had a reputation to uphold." He described how the command made sure every released prisoner was processed clean, fed, and medically cleared before being handed over to the South Vietnamese or released to Red Cross custody. For the prisoners, those months carried a different kind of tension. Rumors spread through the camps, stories of peace agreements, of possible exchanges, of the war finally ending. Some didn't believe it. Others began to count the days by the frequency of Red Cross visits, which had increased as negotiations in Paris gained ground. The Americans allowed inspectors to record conditions, to verify rosters, to take notes on camp operations. It was part of the transparency the U.S. command insisted on, the idea that the way they ran their camps reflected the kind of nation they represented. As 1973 approached, the camps began the process of release and repatriation. Long Binh, Pleiku, and other major sites saw the gradual clearing of barracks that had been filled for years. The same organization that had once managed rations and sanitation now managed departure lists. Each man leaving was checked medically, washed, and given clean clothes, often the same American fatigue material that had once marked the line between guard and captive. For some guards, watching prisoners walk free was strange. They had spent months, sometimes years, enforcing ghouls over men who had once been their enemies in combat.
Now those same men were being escorted to trucks, buses, or helicopters headed for handover points. Many guards didn't speak a word as they watched them go, but a few offered quiet gestures, nods, cigarettes, or handshakes. For all the tension that war brought, routine had made them human to one another. Historians who later studied the records of these transitions found that the American POW camps in Vietnam remained among the most documented detention systems of that era. The layers of paperwork, from soap inventory sheets to Red Cross inspection logs, painted a picture of an institution that had maintained discipline until the very end. There were issues, of course, occasional shortages, overcrowding, moments of friction, but the broader pattern held steady: control through structure, not fear. And that structure became part of the legacy. When the final American units pulled back, they left behind not just empty barracks, but a record of how they believed a professional army should act even in a war that had long lost its clear purpose. For the men who served as guards, this was a point of quiet pride. They had seen the war at its worst: villages destroyed, ambushes, confusion. But inside the wire, they had preserved something different, a line of order that never broke. Decades later, former prisoners and American personnel would occasionally meet again through reconciliation programs or interviews. Some spoke with translators, others met silently, exchanging nods of recognition. What surprised researchers was how many of the Vietnamese veterans remembered not the fences or the guards' rifles, but the daily routines, the showers, the inspections, and the strange smell of American soap. To them, that smell had come to symbolize a moment of clarity in a war filled with chaos. For the Americans who'd run those camps, that memory carried a different meaning. It reminded them that in the middle of one of the most divisive conflicts in U.S. history, there were still rules they followed because they believed that was what separated soldiers from savages. "We couldn't change the war," one retired MP said years later, "but we could keep our corner of it clean." And in the sense, that's what the story of those camps became. Not about luxury, not about comfort, but about control, order, and identity. The soap and showers, the inspections, the paperwork, they weren't acts of generosity. They were affirmations of what it meant to serve under a flag that claimed decency even when the world around it fell apart. When the last prisoners were transferred and the gates finally closed, the camps faded quietly from public memory. The jungle reclaimed the land, the fences rusted, and the huts sank back into the ground. But for those who had lived or worked there, the lessons remained: that discipline can outlast confusion, and that even in the harshest places, a sense of order can be its own kind of mercy. That was the strange paradox of those years: a war remembered for chaos, and yet inside the camps, a calm so precise it bordered on ritual. A place where enemies shared the same water, the same soap, and for a brief moment, the same silence.